not the sort of news we like. Telephone bills went up. If call girls can't afford to call, they'll have to strike.
England is sick. Its members are being swept by a disinfectant-proof plague. Not a plague that rots the guts, blinds the eyes or shakes the limbs, but one more fatal that infects the regions of the mind. It is satire. Satire, as most modern plagues, crossed the Atlantic on the backs of diseased American rats. Sick performers crowded our shores. At first, the outbreak was confined in insanitary cellars and poisoned the nightclub minks. But as all such, it spread insidiously, before long gripping native hearts with a yet more deadly venom that it had the invading vermin. I must say, reading that now, it makes me highly embarrassed, way over the top, and I don't think probably very accurate, but there we are.
Well, that was Robert Cheshire reading his review of That Was the Week That Was, written when he was an undergraduate 30 years ago. His reaction to this new Saturday night review that appeared on television in 1962 might have been overexcited, but then that's the effect it had on you. I remember being extremely overexcited myself. Before we knew where we were, we'd been snatched up into a thrilling weekly routine, unlike anything we'd known, your demure living room becoming a sort of den for instant, raw, dangerous satire. That Was the Week That Was had started its 18-month career, looking through a very bold eye at current events.
Tomorrow's Sunday newspapers, in fact, are full of small news. We read here, Lord Hume in bed with flu. Or, if you prefer, Lord Home in bed with flu. The new conservative image.
Television was in its infancy, even then. And so actually there were no rules. And so therefore you could come up with a new programme. And coming up with That Was the Week was really, as the authorities saw it, no different than coming up with Monitor or coming up with Tonight or coming up with Panorama.
But of course, when it came to it, it wasn't at all like Tonight or Panorama. They may have had a sharp edge, but they didn't outrage. And they weren't the pure television that TW3 was. There'd never been anything like this topical and satirical look at the past week through sketches, songs and monologues. You saw the bare bones of the studio, all the working parts, cameramen wheeling themselves in and out, Millicent Martin, David Frost or Bernard Levin hurrying to get into position for a new sketch, the audience, all the nerves of the thing. It was live, and everything you saw told you it was being done entirely on nerves and stop-press excitement. For the first time, you felt that through television, a very large part of the nation could meet and sit together under a single, rather wicked roof. And even before it got on the air, as John Bassett, the assistant producer, remembers, TW3 was wicked.
The best thing of all was the pilot for the Bernard Levin interview, which was Bernard Levin and 40 Tory ladies. No less than 40, and all of them hatted, twin-setted and pearled, and straight from Conservative Party conference. They turned up thinking that it would be a learned discourse, and it was, but it was very one-sided, since Bernard was given 15 minutes to tell them that they were redundant war horses. In the discussion that followed, one lady got up and said, "Mr. Macmillan has always satisfied me." And we knew we had a winner.
We watched it religiously. If you were at a party, you know, sort of they'd turn the record player off and no people would stop pouring drinks and we'd sit around and watch DW3 assiduously, you know. It was the humour for the time.
People would leave the pub and rush home. I mean, the pubs were deserted. It is no exaggeration to say that on a Saturday night, far from being a thronging mass, by about 10:20, they were empty.
They would be. The first show had an audience of 3 million, which after just a few months had swollen to 13 million. But what exactly was it that emptied the pubs and kept me, as I remember, a professionally and domestically exhausted 40-year-old, awake for longer than I'd have chosen?
If I wasn't a bird, I think I'd like to be a cardinal. Think of all those thousands of lucky old men who've had 8 weeks in Rome for the Vatican Council. 8 weeks in Rome. But it's all over today and they've got to go home back to Iceland, Ireland, England, Labrador. And they don't come back until the 8th of September next year. No wonder they're feeling sad.
The fact that politicians, the royal family, the church were being lampooned was what kept us glued to it. It was the first time this had happened on the public air, which was really the property of the establishment. So it was a shock element that was wonderful to watch. You felt, yes, we're on the verge of a change, and this is a harbinger of it.
I think that was a week that there was a shed of humour. It punctured pomposity. Is that the word? Yeah. It punctured pomposity.
You stuck the pen in and then the wind came out.
The big one.
Once the wind came out, people started looking round and looking why and questioning why.
It lambasted, it lampooned. It was something new. It was great. It lambasted and lampooned the lot.
Time and Tide, October 1963. Where is the once respected BBC going? That Was the Week That Was has added a new quality to its irresponsible offensiveness. It is now sinister. The young men let loose in this programme find it easy to sow in shallow minds distrust of Britain's institutions, whether royalty, religion or morality. Does the Director-General realise the power he is letting these young irresponsibles use? If he does not, someone should tell him.
But that's exactly what lots of people did. The BBC received thousands of telephone calls and letters asking the Director-General, Hugh Carlton-Green, to take action. But he was extremely sympathetic to the programme. In fact, it was partly his idea. His own background as a foreign correspondent for The Times had given him an appetite for the sort of hard-hitting political review he'd encountered on the continent. He was obstinately young in spirit, and the TW3 team was very young. David Frost, the anchorman, was only 22 when it started. This young post-war generation made natural lambasters and lampooners, as Robert Cheshire remembers.
Satire was the obvious way of doing it for young people, I think. People were used to poking fun at their elders and betters in private. I mean, everyone does it at school all the time. It's a natural tool, in a sense, for the young. And you couldn't get, people of that age couldn't get on the same platform with the Prime Minister. There was no other way at them. They couldn't get on the same platform as the Archbishop of Canterbury. Probably if they wrote letters to the Times, whatever the conventional forum for saying you disagreed was, they wouldn't have been printed. I mean, it was a way through that other forms of communication didn't offer. Once the media, like pop music, like television, once they existed, to which young people could get access, then they had a platform.
And once the young had a platform, they made full use of it. No one was safe from TW3, not Guard or Mr. Macmillan, not farmers or advertising executives, not Princess Alexandra or High Court judges. There were cries from Westminster for the BBC to be impeached. And when 13 MPs were spotlighted for not having spoken in the House for a long time, one of them, Sir Norman Hulbert, demanded that TW3 be arraigned for breach of privilege. TW3's scurrilous, direct and hard-hitting sketches alarmed the establishment and earned the programme some highly placed enemies, as Ned Sherrin, the producer, remembers.
Reginald Bevins, the Postmaster General, I believe, sent a memo to Harold Macmillan saying, I'll have this stopped. And Macmillan sent back a very quick memo saying, oh, no, you won't. He knew perfectly well that to attack it, because it had leapt into such immediate popularity, was going to be counterproductive. He came down to Television Centre one night and said, I gather you have some sort of Saturnalia here on Saturdays.
I wanna go back to Mississippi, where the scent of blossoms kiss the evening breeze, where the Mississippi mud kinda mingles with the blood of the niggers who are hanging from the branches of the trees.
Well, what was the recipe for TW3 for this Saturday night Saturnalia? This song suggests at least two of the ingredients that went into it. There'd been that week a horrible murder in the southern states of America, and the chorus were dressed as black and white minstrels in order to jam that sentimental and patronising image up against the ugliness of the event and the words. It was all current affairs, chopped up together with music hall, with a dressing of continental-type cabaret. In the same programme you might have Lance Percival in his calypsos, Bernard Levin and his invective, Millicent Martin and her voice, David Frost and his sneer, Roy Kinnear and his stomach, Randolph Churchill growling about the week in politics, and high-kicking chorus girls in fishnet tights. And the prime mover of this eclectic mix was Ned Sherrin.
I'm a news junkie, and at the same time I've always been fascinated by the musical theatre and music hall. And I suppose as we went on trying to find new ways of presenting the news in a dramatised way, one was able or encouraged to call more and more on the theatrical devices that I'd known and loved in the music hall. Our attitude really was that we wanted to establish this new way of talking to the audience, so that we were complicitous with the audience and not talking down to them. The other big feeling about it was that Saturday night is a very special time in the week. It's like a mini New Year's Eve. That week is over. If it's been good, you celebrate. If it's been bad, you want to forget it. And our job, I think, was to be sort of sceptical and inquiring and amused and occasionally affronted.
Mississippi is the state you've got to choose, where we hate all the darkies and the Catholics and the Jews, where we welcome any man if he's white and strong and belongs to the Ku Klux Klan.
What became evident was that TW3 was feeding a particular and tremendous national hunger.
People like being talked to intelligently. It was stunning. I mean, just as journalists write for Private Eye with an item that they know is true but can't put on in there, we used to get a large number of items and stories. I mean, an enormous number. You felt when you were watching a sketch that you were getting some news from the inside. You felt that maybe they weren't saying all they knew, but they were saying a lot more than any other programme did.
They certainly were. Here was a new generation delightedly breaking with the past, and their being excluded from inside knowledge was a big part of that past. TW3 actually galvanised people who had inside knowledge, highly placed inside people, into writing for the programme, sometimes unsolicited, making their insideness available to outsiders, and this appealed especially to the forward-looking and rebellious young.
Well, shake it up, baby, now. Shake it up, baby. Twist and shout, twist and shout.
We saw ourselves as instruments of change. I think we thought we could change the world. The standards that we had been brought up with, we felt were far too rigid and ought to be relaxed. Therefore, you tended to cock a snook at what we considered to be old-fashioned ideas and the fact that we were going to change them, that all sorts of things which were considered antisocial and not very good behaviour, we were going to make them more acceptable. And I think we started on that in the 60s. Everything which was there for change.
So we had this great appetite. This was the start of the 1960s. The Beatles released their first LP, the pill went on sale, Lady Chatterley's Lover was sold above the counter, Dogs and then Men went into space, John Kennedy became America's youngest president, Telstar was launched, and Mary Quant started to make the King's Road swing. There was no time for old habits, no time for helplessly accepting whatever was happening, no time for respectfulness.
Little Black Bander had been imprisoned for 5 months without trial. Lord Justice Devlin had found out the truth about the government's police state in Nyasaland. Singularly unfortunate, cried the Manningham buller. Even the Lennox Boyd offered to resign. No, no, said Uncle Mac. If at first you don't succeed, let's have another commission. Meanwhile, you must continue to show the natives that we really mean business. And when Uncle Mac and the Lennox Boyd talked about business, they didn't mean economic development. So Uncle Mac searched through all his friends and acquaintances, through all his relations by blood and by marriage, for someone he could trust. And there was no one.
Something new was happening in terms of the way that the wider general public was allowed to perceive its rulers. I suppose if you look back historically, the 18th century or whatever, there had been lampooning of this sort, but there was a very small literate class. Television opened up politics and the political debate to everybody. So you were opening the green beige door between the servants' quarters and the respectable folk, and allowing the servants to see what was going on. And that, I think, was what offended the people who wrote into the papers and called the BBC and shouted that this kind of television shouldn't be allowed.
I think a lot of people were just outraged. And I occasionally watched this with my parents, and my father, after a while, he'd say, "Do we have to watch this stuff?" Or, "Why are we listening to such rubbish?" And it got your teeth on edge sometimes. When they started being rude about the Queen, I think that was something that really upset people. It was one thing to talk about the monarchy as an institution, quite another to be personal about the Queen.
And now the Queen, followed by Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, steps aboard the royal barge that will carry them out to the Britannia. And as the barge moves slowly away from the quayside, it is becoming clear that something has gone wrong. The royal barge is, as it were, sinking. And now the Queen, smiling radiantly, is swimming for her life. Her Majesty's wearing a silk ensemble in canary yellow. And Lord Snowdon has just taken a colour photograph. And what a gesture. The band of the Royal Marines have struck up "God Save the Queen."
Well, if jokes about the royal family seemed to you the first rumblings of revolution and ruin, then clearly you were an enemy of TW3. But objections to it were sometimes more complex and subtler than that.
It was a group of rather smirking people, giggling to each other about the absurdity of government. Here is the public beard, pull it. Here is government, cheek it. Here are people in authority, they must be fools, rogues and pompous old sods, mustn't they? Let's giggle at them together. It got rather dislikable, actually, in many ways, because it was the collective voice of smart people at the expense of people in authority. And to some of us, when we thought of people in authority, we found the smart people actually more odious than the people in government.
Good evening, peasants.
Good evening, Efron.
Nobody but a lunatic would claim that we don't need you. But nobody, on the other hand, but a farmer would claim that the upwards of £3,000 million that you have had in public subsidies of one kind or another since the end of the war were entirely justified and invariably well spent. Certainly we need you. Certainly you do well by us. But let us please end the myth of the farmer, for it produces inefficiency, it reduces the total national good, and it enables the community to dip its hand deeper and deeper into the public pocket. Peasants, do come off it.
Mr. Drama critic Bernard Levin. But you haven't mugged this one up, Mr. Levin.
You see,
you ought to have
come on,
mugged
what are the prices
on the continent?
I'll tell you, Mr. Levin.
Bernard Levin, he just seemed to come forward to the microphone and pontificate about the government, about the situation, about religion, about anything, as if he was telling us all how to live and what was wrong with the world. And he really was such a know-all. I did see the programme when some member of the public came on into a discussion with Bernard Levin, and this man actually got up and punched him. I mean, I was delighted. I think so many people were delighted because he just got so near the bone. It was offensively near the bone. It was near people's really sincerely felt standards, and it just attacked them all. But although we in some ways couldn't stand it, we couldn't turn it off either.
To the Director General of the BBC. Sir, I write in the hope that you may exercise your authority to have That Was the Week That Was cleansed of nasty indecencies. The whole programme is spoilt by the injection of some embarrassing item. mostly delivered with the lascivious leer of a dockside Arab trying to sell dirty postcards. Will you not exercise your authority and cleanse the Augean stables?
That was written by a retired lieutenant colonel. There was uproar. Some BBC governors threatened to resign unless they were promised that the deity would be left out of it. Everybody was arguing with everybody else. Arguing about TW3 was one of the pleasures it offered. I particularly remember the claim that it was destructive only, although the very function of satire is to demolish. It was clear to me what was being pointed at by these critics, an element of, as it were, the shared sneer. David Frost was very sneering. The show was always coming back to his marvellously curled lip. But I had the strongest feeling, and I think it was the commonest feeling, that this satire was offered as a tool for the use of the audience. In the nature of the show, it could not be exclusive. On a huge scale, it drew people in, and it held them there.
Are you telling me you're worried because if we get into the common market, your food will be so much cheaper?
No, worried about you. We're worried about you. You're the one who'll be worried. Your food will be
Farmer's Sleigh Levin. Here we have people, you might say it's legs 11. Farmers up against these fellows, it was Bernard Levin. And I must say, these intelligent farmers, I'm very glad to see. I don't know much about farmers, but I must say none of them look like them archers to me.
Very tired, says my diary for a Sunday in 1963, kept up late by TW3. That weekly Saturnalia was exhausting. The very energy and wickedness of it tired you out. You were made bone-weary by the way it played with fire, and being made bone-weary was part of the joy of it. But for better or worse, it was a deeply instructive Saturnalia. It did not leave the nation in the state in which it found it.
I do think that over 18 months, which was how long that was the week ran, there grew to be a healthy lack of trust in the political outpourings of the time. And people did not accept what the politicians told them, nor did they accept what the politicians were doing.
And one of the strongest examples of this was a devastating sketch about a disastrous Home Secretary, Henry Brooke, a sketch that was said, partly at least, to be responsible for his loss of office. But the spirit behind the programme didn't simply and always lead to cutting people down like that. On one memorable occasion, it led to the paying of a tribute, and by universal assent a remarkable tribute, to someone who, in a more dreadful sense, had been cut down.
News has just come in that President Kennedy has been shot. There's no news yet of his condition. It happened as the President was riding with his wife in an open car through the streets of Dallas, Texas. Several shots rang out, and the President collapsed into the arms of his wife.
When the news came through just before 8 o'clock last night, more than 1,000 people all over London caught buses or tube trains, took taxis, drove or walked to the American Embassy in Grosvenor Square. They had to do something. In Berlin, Mayor Willy Brandt asked people to put lighted candles in their darkened windows. Within minutes, they were flickering out all over the city. In Moscow at 8:05, the radio broke into its programs to announce the news. It was followed by solemn organ music.
Yesterday, 1 man died. Today, in America, 60 lost their lives in a fire. And yet somehow it is the one that matters. Even in death, it seems, we're not equal. Death is not the great leveller. Death reveals the eminent.
I remember the gratitude I felt, the gratitude people generally felt for TW3's response to that monstrous event. Because of the hopes that had been universally attached to him, because his assassination was perhaps the major outrage that brought a more innocent world to an end, the shock was enormous, and so too was the longing for some fitting tribute to be paid. And what happened was that fitting tribute was offered by this programme that appeared to be devoted to irreverence and ridicule.
A young man rode with his head held high under the Texas sun, and no one guessed that a man so blessed would perish by the gun. Lord, would perish by the
And almost coinciding with this important programme, the end came for TW3, taken off in the very middle of a series. They said it was because a general election was at hand. They said...
Sunday Telegraph, December 1963. Rather sadly, the very last shot of the very last That Was the Week That Was of an empty studio, magically stripped of every reminder of the company of young people who for 18 months had shocked, stimulated, delighted and antagonized their audience. The programme concluded with Herbert Kretzmer's ballad on the assassination of President Kennedy, and then the players piled into a sports car used in a previous sketch and drove away. One was suddenly aware of how little they relied on physical settings or props. When they drove away, the show simply disappeared.
Recalling the atmosphere of TW3, I find myself back in a Britain that seemed on the verge of opening up hugely. Those Saturday nights tingled with an expectation bigger than the programme itself. All those locked official cupboards were going to be forced open, and among the instruments used were going to be high spirits and great amounts of laughter. TW3 was using the air that didn't belong to it, that belonged to the establishment, but perhaps doing that it would make the air truly public. In fact, it was an important part of a general move towards less obsequious, less deferential journalism. It made it much more difficult for inside knowledge to remain inside. All the same, I think, like many who rejoiced in TW3, I have a sense of something approached from which we then retreated. Perhaps it was that jubilant wickedness that we lost. The 60s went on to express it, but largely without that special element which TW3 offered, in which entertainment and information shared the same focus.
There is nothing in the world as powerful as humour at getting things done. Humour will achieve miracles where persuasion, logical argument, any other form of communication will more than likely fail. Humour moves mountains.
That was the week that was over, let it go. Oh, what a week that was. That was the week that was.